The drawing room was a tableau of shock and confusion. Guests stood frozen, some clutching each other, others gaping at the still form of Colonel Blount. A few cried out again, half in panic, half in disbelief, and Mrs. Herring tottered to the nearest chair, muttering about fainting spells she did not actually feel. The housekeeper, Mrs. Drake, had taken charge instinctively, ordering the frightened servants to fetch lamps and blankets, while simultaneously directing the women away from the scene. Miss Marple, however, remained where she was, her eyes calm, her hands folded neatly over her knitting bag. She observed the faces around her with a precision that might have seemed idle if one did not know the depth of her insight. Each twitch, each falter of attention, spoke volumes. Clara Blount, whose cheeks were pale with fright, stood rigid near the mantelpiece, glancing furtively at Henry Cartwright, who in turn looked both guilty and confused, as if he could not comprehend what had occurred. Reverend Green, collar damp with sweat, moved closer to the center of the room, attempting to restore order with words that rang hollow in the charged silence. Meanwhile, Mrs. Weatherby and Mrs. Finch whispered amongst themselves, sharing theories already forming in the minds of the startled villagers. An accident, a stray bullet from the colonel's own revolver, or, more sensationally, an act of deliberate violence. Miss Marple noted these murmured conjectures but paid them no heed. Her mind was already turning over subtleties that no one else seemed to register. The faint scuff mark on the hearthrug, the slight smudge of dirt on the colonel's cuff, the oddly serene expression on the face of Mrs. Drake. All these details lodged themselves in her mind, forming patterns invisible to the untrained eye. The local doctor, summoned in a flurry of urgency, pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the colonel. His examination was brisk and professional, though even he could not conceal the flicker of unease crossing his features. A moment later, he rose and cleared his throat. "I'm afraid he is dead," he said, his voice steady but grim. The words seemed to hang in the air, and a collective gasp swept through the room. In that instant, Miss Marple understood something crucial. Panic would cloud judgment, and hasty conclusions could be disastrous. She remained seated, calm, and silently began to catalogue each reaction. The first to speak after the doctor's declaration was Henry Cartwright, who approached the nearest window as if to escape the uncomfortable weight of scrutiny. "Surely," he stammered, "this must have been an accident. The colonel was fond of showing off his revolver. It must have discharged by mistake." His eyes, however, flicked repeatedly toward Clara, and she returned his gaze with a mixture of indignation and apprehension. Miss Marple's attention lingered on the two of them, noting the subtle exchange, the unspoken tension between their words and their expressions. Mrs. Drake, having regained some composure, moved to gather the teacups and trays, her hands shaking slightly. She made a show of efficiency, yet the slight delay in her movements caught Miss Marple's eye. It was a detail most would dismiss, but it suggested either distraction or an internal calculation, something uncharacteristic for someone usually meticulous. The guests began to cluster into small groups, whispering theories and recounting moments from the afternoon, their voices blending into a low, insistent hum. Mrs. Herring suggested that perhaps a family feud had escalated beyond reason. Mrs. Weatherby muttered that she had long suspected the colonel's fortune was ill-gotten. Each comment was recorded in Miss Marple's mind, not as fact, but as potential insight into motive, temperament, and opportunity. As the minutes passed, the rain began to slacken, dripping gently from the eaves, and a few of the braver villagers moved to glance at the scene more closely. Miss Marple allowed them this small indulgence while keeping her own observations methodical. She noted, with quiet satisfaction, that the revolver lay on its side with the hammer down, as if deliberately placed rather than dropped in a skiffle. The angle of the wound, which she inferred from the doctor's brief nod, suggested that the shot had come from close range and was likely not self-inflicted. Her mind turned to the subtle social dynamics at play, The strained conversation she had overheard between Clara and Henry, the Colonel's habitual impatience, and the keen eyes of Mrs. Drake, which hinted at knowledge she had not yet revealed. The constable from the village police arrived, bowing nervously to the assembled company, and immediately began taking statements. His questions were careful, but somewhat mechanical, failing to pierce the layers of tension and pretense. Miss Marple listened politely, occasionally nodding as if to aid his procedure, while silently correcting the oversights in his assumptions. The constable assumed an accident or a sudden heart attack. Miss Marple, however, could feel the threads of something more deliberate weaving through the room. There was a pause in the questioning when Clara, overwhelmed, fled to the library, and Henry followed reluctantly. In their absence, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to drift toward the window, noticing faint footprints on the muddy path outside. They were too small for the Colonel and too irregular for a servant, suggesting someone had been moving about shortly before the tragedy. This small clue, though insignificant to others, settled firmly in her mind. Minutes later, she approached the hearth, crouching to examine the revolver and the rug with discreet attention. Every crease, every displaced item told a story, and Miss Marple's experience with human behavior allowed her to interpret the narrative quietly, but with precision. A distant echo of a wordless confrontation, a hidden motive, and the careful positioning of objects coalesced in her mind. She rose, setting down her knitting bag once more, eyes calm but keenly aware. The villagers, still unsettled, could only speculate, their imaginations running wild with scandal and suspicion. Miss Marple, in contrast, began to see the outlines of the truth forming, subtle and understated, yet unmistakably present. By the time the rain had ceased and the clouds had parted, leaving the lawn damp and glistening, the room had settled into a tense stillness. Guests lingered uneasily, casting furtive glances at one another, while the constable attempted to maintain order. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She knew that what had happened was not the result of accident or folly alone, and that the careful unraveling of human nature, its envies, its grudges, and its secrets, would soon reveal the culprit. The first whispers of suspicion, of hidden motives, and of clandestine meetings had only just begun. And as she observed the interplay of fear, guilt, and pretense, Miss Marple understood that this, the most ordinary of garden parties, had become the stage for a drama far more intricate than anyone in Little Melford could yet imagine. The constable, a young man with an eager but nervous air, busied himself with taking notes while Miss Marple continued to observe quietly from her corner. Guests whispered behind cupped hands, their voices threaded with speculation, fear, and scandal. Mrs. Weatherby, recovering her composure, whispered urgently to Mrs. Finch about the Colonel's fortune and whether the family might be involved in something unsavory. Miss Marple, however, gave no outward sign of listening to their conjectures, though each word, each inflection, added a layer to the subtle portrait she was forming. Henry Cartwright lingered near the window, attempting to calm himself while glancing at the library where Clara had withdrawn. The air between them seemed taut with unspoken recrimination, a tension that Miss Marple noted with a quiet satisfaction. Mrs. Drake had moved to tidy the overturned tray, her hands deft, yet her eyes darting toward the hearth, as if anxious for confirmation that no one had noticed something she had done, or perhaps something she had seen. The constable's questions were methodical, but lacked the depth necessary to unearth the subtleties Miss Marple intuitively understood. He asked who had seen what and when, and whether anyone had touched the revolver. Answers were given nervously, sometimes with hesitation, other times with inadvertent embellishment, each adding new shades to the growing picture. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn not to the statements themselves, but to the inconsistencies in tone, the fleeting gestures, and the rapid, almost imperceptible shifts of expression that accompanied them. It was these human nuances that revealed far more than the spoken words. The doctor, finishing his brief inspection, had retired to the corner of the room, speaking quietly with Mrs. Drake, and Miss Marple caught the tilt of his head, the faint line of worry across his forehead as he considered the circumstances. She made a mental note. The body's position, the angle of the wound, and the revolver's placement all suggested intention, careful rather than accidental. A distant memory of a story from a neighboring village flickered across her mind, though she dismissed it as a loose analogy. It was the patterns here in Little Melford that mattered. Slowly, she rose and moved toward the window where Henry lingered. She remarked gently on the damp footprints outside, observing with the casual curiosity of one noting weather patterns, yet noting the way Henry stiffened as if caught in a minor deception. "Strange, isn't it?" she murmured. "Rain leaves such particular marks. One almost wonders who has been walking about." Henry's eyes flickered at her remark, his expression momentarily betraying discomfort before he forced a neutral smile. Miss Marple noted the slight flush that crept across his cheek and the subtle tension in his shoulders. The interaction was brief, polite, and seemingly inconsequential, but she filed the moment away as significant. Meanwhile, Clara returned from the library, her steps measured and her expression carefully controlled. She greeted her aunt, Mrs. Herring, with an air of composure, yet Miss Marple observed her hands, tightly clasped, knuckles white, betraying anxiety beneath her outward poise. Mrs. Drake had retreated to a side table, arranging teacups with meticulous precision, and Miss Marple, noticing the order in her movements, reflected on how the woman's attention to detail could either conceal or reveal critical information. The constable, attempting to maintain authority, requested that no one leave the room until proper statements had been recorded. Guests shuffled uneasily, some stealing glances at one another, suspicion clouding their otherwise polite demeanors. Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, connecting fragments of behavior, whispered comments, and fleeting looks into an invisible web of interpersonal relations, each thread potentially pointing toward motive or opportunity. She considered the colonel's character, his temperament, and the subtle ways he had asserted dominance over his household and the villagers alike. Such dominance often bred resentment, sometimes silent and latent, sometimes more openly hostile, and Miss Marple suspected that one or more of those present were hiding not only surprise and fear, but an underlying culpability. A knock at the door announced the arrival of the vicar, who entered with hesitancy, surveying the room with concern. His voice, gentle yet firm, attempted to soothe panic while he inquired after the facts, receiving only partial answers. Miss Marple observed the vicar's difficulty in penetrating the layers of social performance, noting how often the villagers' niceties masked true emotions. She also considered the roles of the servants, particularly Mrs. Drake, whose movements and choices had subtly shifted the scene without the notice of the untrained eye. A brief silence fell over the room as everyone processed the vicar's calm presence, broken only by Mrs. Weatherby's whispered speculation about the estate and inheritance, which drew glances from several listeners, including the flushed and uneasy Henry. Miss Marple seized on the moment to assess individual reactions, noting who avoided eye contact, who lingered near exits, and who positioned themselves close to the body under the guise of propriety. Each micro-movement, each hesitation, contributed to the story unfolding before her. By mid-evening, the storm had passed entirely, leaving a damp hush over the manor grounds. The constable, now slightly more confident, began grouping statements and noting inconsistencies, unaware that the most critical observations were taking place in quiet corners, recorded only by Miss Marple's keen eye. She considered the delicate balance of opportunity, motive, and subtle deceit, aware that any one misstep or unguarded moment could reveal the truth long before conventional questioning. As the room settled into a tense equilibrium, the first faint suggestions of potential conflict began to circulate. Subtle accusations disguised as concern, veiled glances between those with history, and the cautious probing of intentions masked by civility. Miss Marple, calmly seated, knitting needles resting lightly in her hands, allowed herself a small smile of quiet anticipation. The intricate puzzle had begun to take shape, and the careful orchestration of human behavior promised to expose the hidden threads of the evening's tragedy in due course. Every glance, every whispered comment, and every hesitation formed part of the intricate map she was silently sketching, ready to unravel the mystery that the village, in its fear and confusion, could not yet see. As the evening shadows lengthened across Melford Manor, the air inside the drawing-room grew thick with unease. Guests shifted nervously, attempting to reconcile the polite composure demanded by decorum with the shock of the Colonel's sudden death. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace, observed each movement with her customary subtlety, her knitting lying untouched on her lap as she catalogued expressions, gestures, and fleeting glances. The constable, now somewhat steadier in his role, began asking more pointed questions, seeking to establish a clear timeline of events, but his methodical approach seemed almost futile in the face of the intricate social tapestry of Little Melford. He inquired first of the servants, who recounted the afternoon's proceedings with hesitant precision, emphasizing the storm's sudden arrival and the confusion that had ensued. Their accounts were consistent yet curiously incomplete, leaving small gaps that hinted at overlooked details, and Miss Marple filed each omission away as potentially significant. Mrs. Drake, the housekeeper, answered politely, her voice calm, but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease whenever the conversation returned to the revolver. Miss Marple noted the quick adjustments of her posture, the slight tightening of her hands, the subtle avoidance of direct eye contact when asked about the weapon's placement, and she understood that the woman's knowledge extended beyond mere housekeeping. Meanwhile, the guests clustered in small groups, voices lowered but insistent, weaving a tapestry of gossip and conjecture. Mrs. Weatherby and Mrs. Finch whispered furiously, their eyes darting toward Clara and Henry as they speculated on potential motives. Mrs. Herring, still fluttering slightly from her earlier panic, spoke of family disputes and past grievances, her words flowing faster than the constable could record. Miss Marple listened to all of it with a calm attention that belied the keen analytical process underway in her mind. She recognized patterns not in the events themselves, but in the reactions of the villagers, who hesitated, who interjected unnecessarily, who avoided particular subjects, and who seemed too eager to point blame elsewhere. Each reaction revealed subtle truths about character and motive, and she allowed herself the quiet satisfaction of understanding what others had yet to perceive. Clara Blount returned from the library, her composure slightly regained, though her hands still trembled faintly as she clasped a handkerchief. She approached Henry, exchanging a few words in hushed tones, and Miss Marple observed the guarded expressions, the carefully measured tones, and the imperceptible tension between them. It was clear that some element of their relationship had been strained prior to this afternoon, and the abruptness of the Colonel's death only amplified existing anxieties. The vicar, sensing the growing disquiet, attempted to restore calm, moving between clusters of guests with measured politeness. He offered reassurances, gentle questions, and advice, but even his composed presence could not entirely dispel the murmur of suspicion that had begun to wind through the room. Miss Marple noted how certain guests lingered near him, perhaps seeking comfort or perhaps observing the influence he wielded over others. The constable, growing frustrated with the subtlety of human behavior, began to press questions regarding the revolver more insistently. Who had handled it? Who had been near the hearth when the shot occurred? Miss Marple, recognizing the danger of assumptions, allowed him to proceed while internally cataloguing each answer, filtering the statements through her understanding of human psychology. She noted, in particular, the careful choice of words by Mrs. Drake and the minor inconsistencies in timing presented by the servants, all of which hinted at movements and observations not yet disclosed. Outside the drawing-room, the rain had ceased entirely, leaving the gardens glistening in the waning light, and faint footprints on the muddy paths suggested someone had been walking close to the house in the moments before the shooting. Miss Marple committed these details to memory, noting both the size and pattern of the prints and their potential implications for the evening's events. She understood that the culprit had not acted recklessly, and that the appearance of disorder might well conceal calculated intent. Clara and Henry, drawn into a more private discussion near the window, revealed through subtle gestures and constrained language hints of their recent quarrels, neither willing to speak openly but each betraying emotion in fleeting expressions and shifts of stance. Miss Marple's keen observation picked up on these almost imperceptible signals, understanding that personal grievances, while not motives alone, could illuminate the broader dynamics that had led to the tragedy. Throughout the room, nervous laughter, small exclamations, and whispered conjectures intertwined with the constable's increasingly pointed questions, creating an atmosphere that teetered between civility and apprehension. Miss Marple, quietly assessing, recognized the significance of every pause, every glance, every tentative movement. These were the unspoken confessions of a room filled with human complexity. She noted how the guests arranged themselves socially, who gravitated toward familiar allies, and who lingered uneasily near perceived threats. Patterns emerged, suggesting both motive and opportunity, and Miss Marple allowed her mind to weave the disparate threads into a tentative understanding. By the time the vicar suggested that the guests retire to the adjoining drawing-room for refreshments, a sense of controlled tension had settled over the manor. Each participant carried a private calculation of suspicion, guilt, or fear, unaware that their every behavior was quietly observed and interpreted. Miss Marple, as ever, remained poised, her demeanor unassuming, but her mind was acutely aware of the intricate interplay of human emotion, deception, and instinct that had shaped the afternoon's events. Every small gesture, every whispered remark, and every carefully disguised expression was a piece of a puzzle she would patiently unravel, understanding that the outward chaos masked an inner order, a story told through subtlety and silence, awaiting her quiet but discerning attention to reveal the truth. In that controlled stillness, the first threads of clarity began to form, each subtle observation bringing her incrementally closer to understanding the unseen motives and concealed actions that had turned a simple garden party into the stage for tragedy, and she knew the next steps would require patience, discretion, and careful attention to the human heart. The evening deepened, and the flickering lamplight cast long shadows across the drawing-room, exaggerating the tension that already clung to the walls. Guests moved with tentative steps, their chatter reduced to low murmurs as the gravity of the colonel's death continued to settle upon them. Miss Marple remained quietly attentive, her knitting resting untouched, her eyes sweeping the room with the quiet patience that had served her so well over many years. She observed every gesture, every hesitation, every carefully measured glance, knowing that the truth lay as much in behavior as in words. The constable, growing more flustered with each passing hour, attempted to interrogate the more reticent guests, focusing particularly on the servants who had been closest to the colonel in the afternoon. Their answers were precise but limited, often trailing into pauses that suggested omission or fear, and Miss Marple noted these pauses with care, filing them away as threads to be traced later. Mrs. Drake, the housekeeper, continued her discreet oversight of the room, adjusting silverware and tidying trays as though to distract herself from observation. Miss Marple recognized that habitual meticulousness could both conceal and reveal, and she carefully weighed each of Mrs. Drake's movements, aware that the smallest unconscious action might betray hidden knowledge. Outside, the garden paths glistened from the earlier rain, footprints faintly visible in the softened earth. Miss Marple's mind registered their sizes, the patterns, and the direction of approach, understanding that they spoke to movements unobserved by most of the room. She considered who might have had reason to move about at that precise time, and the possible implications for motive and opportunity. In the corner, Clara Blount, still pale from shock, whispered nervously to Henry Cartwright, their voices low but weighted with emotion. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on them, noting the tension that ran beneath polite conversation, the slight quiver in Clara's hand as she adjusted her glove, and the restrained agitation in Henry's posture. Each detail suggested private disagreements that had existed long before this tragic afternoon, and Miss Marple catalogued them carefully, aware that hidden resentment often bore more consequence than overt animosity. The vicar attempted to restore calm, moving among clusters of villagers and guests with gentle encouragement and quiet reassurances, but even his presence could not entirely dispel the growing unease. Observing the social dynamics, Miss Marple noted the subtle ways alliances formed, who drew near one another for comfort, and who lingered awkwardly, half excluded from polite circles. Such patterns often hinted at prior grievances and unspoken tensions, and she recognized their potential relevance to the present investigation. The constable, growing impatient, turned again to the revolver, questioning who had touched it last. Answers varied in precision and reliability. Some servants spoke with hesitation, others with nervous embellishment. Miss Marple allowed him to continue, listening carefully while mentally filtering out misdirection, exaggeration, and distraction. The critical observations were made in the silent, overlooked corners, the brief avoidance of eye contact, the sudden straightening of posture, the almost imperceptible flinch at a question that seemed trivial to everyone else. It was in these subtle behaviors that the story of the Colonel's last moments would reveal itself. A small commotion near the window drew Miss Marple's attention. One of the villagers had noticed a loose latch on the garden gate, and the discussion briefly turned to the possibility of someone entering or leaving unnoticed. Miss Marple's mind catalogued the observation, but recognized that the significance lay not merely in the latch itself, but in the social context. Who would benefit from concealment, and who would exploit a minor detail to mislead others? As she considered this, the rain-soaked lawn reflected the last light of day, and the sound of distant footsteps outside suggested someone moving with purpose, though the movement was subtle enough that it escaped general notice. Miss Marple registered the pattern with quiet interest, already beginning to link it to the timing of the fatal shot. Throughout the room, whispers of suspicion began to take shape, some directed at servants, others at family members. Mrs. Weatherby's voice, tinged with excitement, suggested foul play, while Mrs. Herring, with nervous enthusiasm, hinted at long-standing grudges that might have escalated beyond control. Miss Marple considered each remark, not as evidence in itself, but as a reflection of perception, desire, and fear. Clara and Henry resumed their private exchange, careful not to let the constable overhear, yet Miss Marple caught every nuance of their conversation, the shifting of weight, the tension in the voice, the slight defensive gestures. It was a delicate dance of emotion, revealing as much as it obscured. By now, the room had settled into a tense stillness, punctuated only by occasional remarks, careful movements, and the faint scratch of the constable's pen. Miss Marple, calmly seated, allowed herself a moment to connect the threads forming before her. The Colonel's temperament, the subtle resentments among the villagers, the reactions of servants, and the fleeting gestures of those closest to him, all were pieces of a puzzle that required patience and careful attention. She began to form a tentative understanding, each small observation reinforcing the patterns she had already discerned. It was clear to her that the truth would not be revealed through hasty questioning or overt display, but through careful attention to the human heart and the unguarded moments that betrayed genuine intent. The faint sounds of movement outside the window and the occasional cough or shuffle within the room were all part of a larger rhythm that Miss Marple noted with quiet satisfaction. The initial panic had passed, replaced by a careful wariness, and in this atmosphere of tentative calm, the subtleties of behavior became more apparent, more revealing. Each glance, each sigh, each hesitant word contributed to the invisible narrative she quietly assembled. By the time the lamps had been adjusted to steady brightness, the first outlines of understanding had begun to emerge in Miss Marple's mind. She recognized the interplay of opportunity, motive, and subtle deceit, and she understood that the evening's events had been orchestrated with care, the outward chaos concealing deliberate intent. In the silence that now filled Melford Manor, Miss Marple remained poised, her calm exterior belying the active mind working tirelessly to unravel the hidden story. She knew that the next steps would require delicate observation and a careful orchestration of social interactions, and she prepared herself to listen, watch and act with the quiet acuity that had solved many such mysteries before. The truth, she understood, lay not in haste but in patience, and in the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of human nature that revealed far more than words could ever convey. The quiet of the drawing-room had settled into an uneasy vigilance, broken only by the soft rustle of dresses and the occasional sigh from those still trembling from the earlier shock. Miss Marple, knitting laid aside, observed the room with an intensity that seemed at odds with her calm, unassuming demeanor. Every twitch of an eye, every small shuffle of a foot, every involuntary tightening of hands told her more than any spoken word could. The constable had retreated to a corner, attempting to organize his notes and statements, but the complex human behavior surrounding him seemed to frustrate his attempts at linear logic. He called forward Mrs. Drake once more, seeking clarification on the positioning of the revolver, the timing of the storm, and whether anyone had entered or exited the room during the critical moments. Mrs. Drake, poised yet faintly uneasy, answered with measured precision, her voice calm but tinged with subtle tension. Miss Marple noted the careful phrasing of her sentences, the slight hesitation before each acknowledgement, and the way her eyes shifted ever so slightly toward the hearth, suggesting she was guarding knowledge not yet revealed. Clara Blount, still pale and trembling slightly, had returned to a seat near the window, her gaze fixed on the rain-dampened garden beyond. Henry Cartwright hovered nearby, his movements constrained, eyes darting nervously toward both the window and the room's center. Their private conversation, though whispered, carried traces of previous disagreements, and Miss Marple watched their subtle exchanges, noting the micro-expressions that betrayed emotion they did not wish to disclose. Even in their restraint, they offered her insight into their relationship and, more importantly, their potential roles in the circumstances that had led to Colonel Blount's death. The villagers, increasingly uneasy, began to murmur more freely among themselves. Mrs. Weatherby and Mrs. Finch speculated openly about the Colonel's fortune, his possible enemies, and the likelihood of foul play. Miss Marple listened quietly, distinguishing between pure conjecture and subconscious signals that could indicate hidden truth. She realized that in the tension of fear and social propriety, small hints of guilt or knowledge often revealed themselves inadvertently through gestures, stammers, or overly precise answers. The vicar moved calmly from one group to another, offering reassurances, gentle admonitions to maintain order, and polite inquiries into anyone's well-being. Miss Marple watched how the villagers responded to him, noting who sought comfort, who observed from a distance, and who lingered close, as if attempting to use his presence to mask their own anxiety. She catalogued these interactions meticulously, aware that social positioning often reflected underlying relationships and, potentially, motives. Outside the window, the garden reflected the last light of day, droplets sparkling across the trimmed hedges and flower beds. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the subtle tracks left in the softened earth, the impressions of boots or shoes moving deliberately but lightly across the grass. She noted the pattern, the size, and the timing implied, understanding that these traces might connect to movements within the manor during the crucial moments before the shot was fired. It was not the mere presence of footprints that interested her, but the suggestion of intention and concealment they implied. Meanwhile, small signs of tension surfaced among the servants, who whispered discreetly about their recollections. Miss Marple observed the nervous glances and minor inconsistencies in their accounts, recognizing that fear often causes details to be distorted or omitted, and that the discrepancies themselves could form a map toward understanding. Clara's hands, folded tightly in her lap, betrayed her anxiety, and Miss Marple took note of the subtle ways she adjusted her posture, how her fingers twitched slightly, and how her eyes avoided certain corners of the room. Henry, for his part, seemed both protective and cautious, his body language alternating between closeness and distance, a silent conflict that revealed as much as any spoken words. The constable attempted to corral the social confusion into formal statements, but the complexity of human behavior made it nearly impossible to extract unambiguous facts. Miss Marple, observing in silence, understood that the story of the colonel's death would not be revealed through coercion or interrogation, but through careful observation of patterns in human behavior and the tiny, often overlooked movements that betrayed truth. Subtle interactions, an eyebrow beside, exchange of glances, a hand reaching instinctively toward a pocket, a fleeting expression of relief or fear were more telling than any declaration, and Miss Marple catalogued them with patient precision. As the evening deepened, the room's atmosphere shifted from overt panic to a tense, watchful stillness. The guests' attention divided between one another, the body of Colonel Blount and the constable's methodical questions, creating a delicate web of observation, pretense, and instinct. Miss Marple allowed her mind to trace these threads quietly, connecting gestures to emotions, statements to probable intentions, and social positioning to potential opportunity. Each fragment of movement, each carefully measured reaction, brought her closer to a cohesive understanding of the hidden dynamics that had culminated in this sudden tragedy. She noted, too, the subtle differences in behavior between those who had long-standing ties to the colonel and those whose presence was more recent, recognizing that familiarity often breeds complex motives that outsiders might overlook. By the time the lamps burned steadily, casting a soft glow over the anxious faces of the villagers and guests, Miss Marple had begun to assemble a preliminary understanding of both the interpersonal relationships and the likely sequence of actions that had led to the fatal shot. She knew that uncovering the full truth would require patience, gentle prompting, and a careful orchestration of observation, for it was in the unguarded moments, the minor slips and fleeting gestures, that the real story lay hidden, awaiting the quiet discernment of one capable of seeing the invisible threads binding human nature to action. The tension in the drawing room had settled into a low hum of cautious observation, each guest uncertain where to look or whom to trust. Miss Marple, quietly seated near the hearth, allowed her eyes to wander from one cluster of villagers to another, recording the subtle interplay of glances, gestures, and hesitant movements that betrayed more than words ever could. The constable, clipboard in hand, continued his diligent questioning, yet his inquiries seemed almost superficial when weighed against the complex social fabric he sought to unravel. He asked about who had seen what and when, about the handling of the revolver and the timing of the storm, but his linear method failed to capture the subtleties of human behavior that Miss Marple understood so well. Mrs. Drake, ever composed yet betraying slight tension in the set of her shoulders and the occasional quickening of her breath, answered each question with care, careful not to offer more than what was asked, yet leaving hints through her pauses, the flicker of her eyes, the momentary tightening of her hands. Miss Marple noticed these inconsistencies and allowed them to guide her thought process, noting that such small gestures often concealed significant truths. Clara Blount remained close to the window, her expression taut with restrained emotion. Her eyes traced the darkened gardens, following the irregular patterns of faint footprints still visible in the wet soil, and Henry Cartwright hovered nearby, torn between offering comfort and maintaining his own composure. Their conversation, though quiet, carried traces of previous disagreements and suppressed frustration, and Miss Marple observed the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts of posture, and the brief tensions in tone that revealed more than the words themselves. The villagers whispered among themselves, conjecturing openly about motives, past grievances, and the possibility of deliberate violence. Mrs. Weatherby leaned close to Mrs. Finch, her voice tight with excitement, while Mrs. Herring, still recovering from earlier panic, contributed her own speculations with nervous energy. Miss Marple, unperturbed, filtered each comment through her understanding of human behavior, recognizing that gossip, fear, and desire to assign blame often revealed the unconscious inclinations and resentments of those who spoke. The vicar, attempting to restore order, moved gracefully between groups, offering gentle reassurances and asking questions of those who appeared most agitated. Miss Marple observed how the villagers responded to his presence, noting who sought solace, who maintained distance, and who lingered close, perhaps to use his authority as a shield or a distraction. These social dynamics, she recognized, were critical to understanding the web of interactions that might have influenced the events leading to the Colonel's death. The faint sounds of movement outside the window caught her attention. Someone walked deliberately along the garden path, leaving impressions in the softened earth. Miss Marple's mind registered the timing, size, and direction of these tracks, understanding that they could correlate with actions inside the manor during the crucial moments before the fatal shot. She was aware that subtle patterns, easily overlooked, often contained the most revealing information. The servants, still tense, whispered discreetly among themselves, offering fragmentary recollections that occasionally conflicted with one another. Miss Marple noted these discrepancies with care, realizing that fear and deference could distort perception, and that the inconsistencies themselves could point toward hidden movements or knowledge. Clara's hands, clasped tightly in her lap, betrayed a nervous energy she could not fully conceal, while Henry's stance alternated between protective attentiveness and constrained agitation, each subtle motion hinting at unspoken concerns. The constable, frustrated by the intricacies of human behavior, pressed for more concrete information, seeking clarity that the unfolding social drama refused to provide. Miss Marple, however, understood that the narrative would reveal itself not through blunt interrogation, but through the quiet, often involuntary actions of those present, each gesture a possible key to motive or opportunity. She considered the complex interplay of personal relationships, the Colonel's commanding nature, lingering family tensions, and subtle rivalries among villagers. These dynamics, she knew, were as likely to explain the tragedy as any tangible evidence. Small exchanges of glance, fleeting touches, and the careful positioning of bodies within the room formed a map of intention, strategy, and concealed emotion, all of which she catalogued with deliberate patience. The lamps had been adjusted to their full brightness, casting a soft glow across anxious faces, illuminating expressions and micro-gestures that otherwise might have gone unnoticed. Miss Marple traced the patterns of interaction, noting who dominated conversation, who deferred, who observed silently, and who displayed fleeting signs of relief or apprehension. Each observation strengthened her developing understanding of the evening's events. By now, the initial panic had given way to a tense, watchful stillness. Guests spoke less, movements were careful, and attention remained focused on the interplay of social cues and hidden truths. Miss Marple, in her quiet corner, allowed the puzzle to take shape. She understood that the sequence of the shot, the movements of individuals, and the hidden resentments of little Melford's residents would soon reveal the perpetrator, and that subtle observation rather than overt questioning would provide the critical insight. As the evening stretched on, the interwoven strands of motive, opportunity, and human behavior grew more apparent, and Miss Marple, calm yet acutely aware, prepared to follow each thread with patience, ready to uncover the concealed narrative behind the sudden, shocking death that had so unsettled the manor and its inhabitants. The room had settled into a peculiar quiet, the kind that carries with it an undercurrent of unspoken tension. Miss Marple remained seated near the hearth, her knitting forgotten, her eyes quietly sweeping the faces of those present. Each expression, each small gesture, each fleeting glance was catalogued in her mind, forming an invisible map of the emotions and intentions that underlay the afternoon's tragedy. The constable had grown increasingly flustered, pacing slightly as he attempted to consolidate the scattered statements into a coherent timeline. But the intricacies of human behavior made his task far from simple. He questioned the servants again, seeking certainty on what they had observed when they had been in the drawing-room and who had handled the revolver. The answers, while polite and precise, were fraught with hesitation and occasional contradictions, and Miss Marple noted each one with the keen attention that had long been her strength. Mrs. Drake, though calm in appearance, betrayed a faint tremor in her hands and a subtle tension in her voice whenever the conversation returned to the revolver or the Colonel's final moments. Miss Marple did not miss the slight narrowing of her eyes or the careful avoidance of certain areas of the hearth, recognizing these as signs of knowledge held but unspoken. Clara Blount had moved closer to the window again, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed on the darkened gardens beyond. Henry Cartwright lingered nearby, tense yet careful, as though wishing to maintain a protective distance while also guarding his own composure. Their quiet exchanges were laden with the residue of previous disagreements, small frictions amplified by the shock of what had occurred, and Miss Marple read the subtle changes in tone and micro-expressions with practiced ease. The villagers continued to whisper among themselves, speculation weaving through the room like a delicate but insistent thread. Mrs. Weatherby's voice carried thinly veiled excitement, Mrs. Herring offered cautious conjectures, and Mrs. Finch contributed observations, each revealing not only what they thought but also the personal biases and long-standing perceptions they brought to the situation. Miss Marple, attentive to each detail, separated fact from emotional color, aware that human nature often obscures as much as it illuminates. The vicar, moving among the groups with gentle authority, attempted to restore calm, offering reassurances and seeking clarity, yet even his presence could not fully quiet the undercurrent of suspicion. Miss Marple observed who gravitated toward him and who avoided him, recognizing that proximity, avoidance, and subtle mimicry all carried insight into character and potential motives. Outside, the garden remained slick with rain, the faint impressions of footprints in the softened earth, a silent record of movement that had gone largely unnoticed by the other villagers. Miss Marple considered their size, direction, and pattern, understanding that the timing of those movements might correspond with the precise moments leading to the fatal shot. Small shifts, easily overlooked, often revealed deliberate intent, and she filed each observation with careful deliberation. The servants, murmuring cautiously, offered fragmentary recollections that occasionally conflicted with one another, and Miss Marple, attuned to these subtleties, weighed each inconsistency as a clue rather than a distraction. Clara's hands, still tightly clasped, betrayed nervous energy, and Henry's constrained motions hinted at restrained emotion and internal conflict. The constable, attempting to elicit clear information, pressed for exact timelines and the specifics of who was where. But Miss Marple knew that truth was often contained in hesitations, slips, and involuntary gestures rather than in rigid answers. She also considered the broader dynamics at play: the colonel's authoritative temperament, subtle resentments among family members, and the delicate rivalries among villagers, all of which might shape opportunity, intention, and the subtle orchestration of events. Small interactions, flickers of expression, the way someone adjusted a sleeve or shifted in a chair, the direction of fleeting glances, formed patterns that Miss Marple quietly traced, each reinforcing her understanding of relationships, tensions, and possible motives. By now, the atmosphere had shifted from open panic to controlled, wary observation. Conversations were muted, movements deliberate, and attention divided between each other, the constable's questions in the body of the colonel. Miss Marple allowed herself to step back in thought, seeing how the interplay of opportunity, motive, and human psychology had quietly guided the unfolding of the tragedy. Each glance, each word, and each motion contributed to a delicate web that, once fully understood, would illuminate the sequence of actions leading to the fatal shot. She noted the subtle positioning of individuals in relation to one another, their social alignments, and their responses to authority, each small element forming part of a larger narrative that was not yet articulated aloud. As the lamps threw warm light across anxious faces, Miss Marple understood that the resolution would come not from forceful questioning, but from patience, observation, and the careful tracing of human impulses. She recognized that the critical moments were hidden within the interactions that seemed insignificant to others, but were, in fact, rich with implication. The first hints of strategy, calculation, and concealed intention had begun to emerge, and Miss Marple, poised and unobtrusive, prepared to follow each thread with the quiet determination that had revealed many secrets in the past. In that stillness, she felt the invisible pulse of the room, the interplay of fear, guilt, resentment, and cautious curiosity. And she knew that the next step, subtle yet decisive, would bring the tangled strands of motive and opportunity into clearer focus, drawing her incrementally closer to the truth concealed beneath the polite facades and whispered conjectures of little Melford's inhabitants. A muted stillness had settled over Melford Manor, the kind that carries both anticipation and unease, pressing on the shoulders of those who lingered within the drawing-room. Miss Marple, quietly perched near the hearth, allowed her gaze to wander from one face to another, observing the faintest flickers of expression, the subtlest shifts in posture, and the nervous twitch of a hand that might otherwise seem inconsequential. The constable, clipboard in hand, had retreated to a corner, attempting once more to impose structure on a situation that resisted simple explanation. His questions, practical and linear, sought clarity regarding the revolver, the precise timing of the storm, and the movements of individuals in the crucial moments preceding the fatal shot. But Miss Marple understood that the truth lay not in answers alone, but in the behaviors those answers accompanied. Mrs. Drake, the housekeeper, responded with measured politeness, yet her voice carried a subtle tension, a tremor only detectable to those attuned to nuance. Miss Marple noted the careful avoidance of direct eye contact, the brief stiffening of shoulders when certain topics arose, and the micro-pauses before each acknowledgement. Such indications were not mere quirks. They were signposts of knowledge restrained, of details deliberately withheld or subconsciously concealed. Clara Blount remained near the window, her posture rigid and her expression taut, eyes tracing the darkened outlines of the rain-slick garden. Henry Cartwright hovered in the vicinity, his presence both protective and hesitant, his restrained movements betraying the careful balancing act of his own unease and desire to offer comfort. Their quiet conversation, though measured and discreet, carried traces of prior tensions that had existed well before this afternoon, amplified now by shock and uncertainty. Miss Marple observed their gestures, the subtle tension in Clara's fingers, the controlled agitation in Henry's posture, and recognized the latent emotional currents that could illuminate both motive and context. Across the room, whispered conjectures flitted among the guests. Mrs. Weatherby spoke in urgent murmurs to Mrs. Finch about long-standing grievances in the Colonel's financial disposition, while Mrs. Herring offered cautious suppositions, weaving them into observations of character and past slights. Miss Marple filtered these comments with precision, separating conjecture born of fear and imagination from subtle indications of knowledge, desire, or resentment. The vicar, moving with quiet composure among the groups, offered gentle reassurances and sought to maintain calm, yet even his presence could not entirely temper the undercurrent of suspicion. Miss Marple noted who drew near him and who lingered distant, interpreting proximity and avoidance as reflections of psychological disposition and potential complicity. Beyond the window, the garden remained glistening from the earlier rain. Faint footprints impressed the softened earth in patterns suggesting deliberate movement along paths that allowed access to and from the house without attracting attention. Miss Marple catalogued these impressions carefully, not merely for their physical presence, but for the implications they carried regarding timing, opportunity, and intent. Servants whispered cautiously among themselves, recalling fragmentary details of the afternoon, each account tinged with fear or uncertainty, and Miss Marple recognized that contradictions often contained as much truth as consistent statements, revealing hidden movements or undisclosed knowledge. Clara's hands remained tightly folded, her nervous energy visible in slight, repeated adjustments, while Henry's stance alternated between protective attention and restrained agitation, signaling an internal conflict between care and personal restraint. The constable, increasingly frustrated with the elusiveness of human behavior, pressed for definitive information, seeking a clean narrative that the subtle interplay of social dynamics refused to provide. Miss Marple, however, understood that the key lay not in linear accounts, but in the intricate web of gestures, expressions, and interactions, the micro-movements that betrayed thought, intent, and hidden motives. She considered the broader social landscape, the Colonel's imperious nature, long-standing rivalries among villagers, and latent family tensions, all contributing layers to the framework within which opportunity and motive had intersected. Small interactions, nearly invisible to casual observers, a glance exchanged across a room, a fleeting touch, the careful positioning of oneself near or away from another, formed the outline of patterns Miss Marple quietly traced, reinforcing her emerging understanding of the events. By now, the atmosphere had evolved from open panic to a tense vigilance, with movements restrained, speech measured, and attention divided among the body of the Colonel, the constable's questions, and the silent monitoring of one another. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to step back, seeing how opportunity, subtle deceit, and emotional currents interwove to shape the events of the afternoon. Each whisper, each glance, each pause contributed to an invisible map of intention and circumstance, and she recognized that the resolution would emerge not from aggressive interrogation, but from patient observation and careful orchestration of the interactions still unfolding. The lamps cast steady pools of light across anxious faces, illuminating subtle cues of tension, apprehension, and fleeting relief, and Miss Marple noted them all, aware that the next critical revelation would arise from the quiet, almost imperceptible moments that revealed true intent. In that composed stillness, she felt the rhythm of the room, the interplay of fear, guilt, curiosity, and concealed desire, and knew that the next subtle maneuver, a carefully posed question or a fleeting observation, could unravel the web and bring the hidden story into sharper relief. Every movement, every minor reaction, and every social alignment hinted at the concealed orchestration behind the tragic shot, and Miss Marple, poised with patient acuity, prepared to follow these threads to their inevitable, illuminating conclusion. A tense quiet settled over the drawing room as the evening deepened, the low murmur of hushed voices underscoring the anxious atmosphere. Miss Marple, seated near the hearth, observed with her customary patience, noting every nuance of expression, every slight shift in posture, and the almost imperceptible glances exchanged between guests. The constable, growing increasingly exasperated, had attempted to impose a more formal structure on the questioning, circling the room to reconfirm statements about the revolver, the timing of the storm, and the movements of those present. His questions were thorough, but lacked the subtlety required to uncover truths hidden within human behavior, and Miss Marple recognized that the vital clues would emerge not from the answers themselves, but from the reactions that accompanied them. Mrs. Drake, her hands folded tightly before her, maintained a calm exterior, yet Miss Marple detected the slightest tremor in her fingers, the rapid blink of her eyes, and the faint stiffening of her shoulders when certain subjects arose. These were not random signs of anxiety. They were indicators of concealed knowledge, subtle markers that suggested she knew more than she let on. Clara Blount remained near the window, her gaze fixed on the darkened garden beyond, fingers gripping the edge of the sill with quiet tension. Henry Cartwright stood nearby, his presence both protective and careful, body language betraying his inner conflict between restraint and concern. Their whispered exchanges, though minimal, carried traces of past disagreements amplified by the shock of the Colonel's sudden death, and Miss Marple noted every micro-expression, every fleeting glance, as an index of hidden emotion and potential motive. The villagers, uncertain how to navigate the sudden disruption of their familiar social order, began murmuring speculations, their voices low but insistent. Mrs. Weatherby's whispers to Mrs. Finch hinted at financial intrigue and long-standing resentments, while Mrs. Herring offered tentative conjectures about personal grievances and family tensions. Miss Marple listened carefully, separating the grain of truth from the noise of fear and imagination, understanding that perception often revealed more about the speaker than about the events themselves. The vicar moved gracefully among the small clusters, offering reassurance, asking gentle questions, and attempting to maintain calm. Miss Marple watched how the villagers responded, noting who sought comfort, who kept their distance, and who lingered near him, interpreting these reactions as subtle indicators of both character and potential culpability. Outside the window, the garden glistened faintly from the earlier rain, the footprints in the softened earth forming irregular patterns that suggested deliberate movement. Miss Marple catalogued these impressions, not merely for their physical placement, but for the implications they carried regarding timing, opportunity, and intent. The servants, whispering discreetly among themselves, offered fragmentary recollections that occasionally conflicted with one another, and Miss Marple understood that these discrepancies were clues in themselves, hinting at hidden movements or withheld information. Clara's tightly clasped hands betrayed anxiety that she could not entirely suppress, and Henry's constrained motions reflected a careful control of emotion, a tension that subtly shifted with each observation of others in the room. The constable, increasingly frustrated, sought definitive answers that human complexity refused to yield. Miss Marple, however, recognized that the narrative of the Colonel's death would reveal itself in the patterns of human interaction. The subtle avoidance of eye contact, the fleeting expression of relief or apprehension, the slight adjustment of posture when questioned, all combining to form an invisible roadmap toward understanding. She considered the wider social and psychological context, the Colonel's commanding presence, simmering rivalries among villagers, and latent family tensions, all of which shaped both opportunity and potential motive. Small interactions, imperceptible to casual observers, formed patterns that Miss Marple traced quietly. A glance shared between two guests, a minor movement toward or away from another, a careful positioning near or distant from the body, each contributing to the emerging picture of relationships, resentment, and potential deception. By now, the initial panic had given way to a tense vigilance. Speech was measured, movements deliberate, and attention divided among the constable's inquiries, the body of the colonel, and the careful observation of one another. Miss Marple allowed herself a moment to step back, seeing how opportunity, subtle deception, and human emotion interwove to shape the unfolding events. Each minor gesture, each whispered remark, each pause in speech contributed to the invisible framework that would reveal both sequence and motive when interpreted correctly. The lamp's warm glow illuminated anxious faces, drawing out subtle cues of tension, fear, and fleeting relief, and Miss Marple catalogued every detail, knowing that the next crucial revelation would arise from these quiet, nearly imperceptible moments. In that composed stillness, she perceived the rhythm of the room, the interplay of guilt, fear, curiosity, and concealed intention, and understood that the subtle orchestration of observation, careful questioning, and the patient tracing of human impulses would soon bring clarity. Every glance, every gesture, and every social alignment hinted at a story deliberately hidden behind the polite facades and whispered conjectures, and Miss Marple, poised with her characteristic acuity, prepared to follow these threads to their inevitable, illuminating conclusion, sensing that the moment for subtle testing and revelation was approaching. The evening had deepened into a hushed stillness, the guests gathered in the drawing room moving almost imperceptibly as they waited for clarity that seemed long in coming. Miss Marple sat with her hands folded, calm and composed, though her mind worked tirelessly, weaving together every observation, gesture, and whispered conjecture that had occurred since the storm had interrupted the garden party. The constable, increasingly uneasy under the weight of the unspoken complexities, fidgeted with his notes, unaware that the true solution lay not in the evidence he could record, but in the subtle interactions of those present. Miss Marple's eyes flicked from one face to another, noting the faintest tension in posture, the quickened blink of an eye, the almost invisible shift of weight, each movement a small confession in its own right. Mrs. Drake, the housekeeper, stood near the sideboard, ostensibly arranging refreshments, yet every careful movement she made betrayed an attention far beyond mere domestic concern. Her hands, though steady, occasionally trembled slightly when her gaze met that of Miss Marple, and the briefest quiver in her lips suggested that she was guarding a secret she was both aware of and anxious about. Clara Blount, still near the window, had regained some composure, but the tension in her shoulders and the tight grip on the handkerchief she held revealed the anxiety that persisted. Henry Cartwright hovered close, his restraint visible in measured movements and careful speech, yet there were micro-expressions, quick flashes of worry, a tightening of the jaw that betrayed concern, unease, and unspoken truths. The villagers whispered among themselves, speculation flitting from one to another, but Miss Marple, attuned to the hidden rhythms of human behavior, sifted instinctively through rumor, exaggeration, and partial truths, extracting the meaningful patterns that lay beneath. She had seen, in the past, how the smallest gesture, a glance, a hesitation, a sudden interest in a trivial matter, could illuminate motive and reveal opportunity, and now every subtlety in the room seemed to align toward an inevitable understanding. The faint traces of footprints in the garden, the slightly askew arrangement of furniture near the hearth, and the brief yet telling expressions on the faces of those present, all contributed to a larger picture that Miss Marple had been constructing silently, patiently, over the course of the evening. She considered each individual's relationship to the colonel, noting past disputes, rivalries, and minor grievances that might escalate under pressure. The constable, still flustered by the lack of concrete evidence, called for yet another round of questioning, but Miss Marple knew that the answers he sought were already manifest, hidden in the subtleties of expression and behavior, rather than in spoken words. With deliberate calm, she began to engage the group, framing questions in the most innocuous way, observing the reactions, noting micro-gestures, the slight shifting of stance, the involuntary tightening of hands, and the fleeting avoidance of eye contact. One by one, inconsistencies and subtle admissions began to surface, each small movement confirming suspicions she had long harbored. It became clear that the most conscientious explanations did not always align with reality, and that the apparent chaos of the afternoon had been a careful orchestration of concealment and misdirection. Miss Marple, in her gentle yet unwavering way, drew the room's attention to these nuances, presenting her observations as casual commentary rather than accusation, allowing the hidden dynamics to emerge naturally. Slowly, the threads coalesced into a coherent understanding. She indicated that the revolver had been moved not by accident, that the apparent confusion had been deliberately amplified, and that the moment of opportunity had been carefully calculated by someone whose intimate knowledge of both the household and the guests provided a distinct advantage. The tension rose subtly as eyes shifted, glances exchanged, and the room waited for clarity. Finally, Miss Marple turned toward Mrs. Drake, speaking softly, almost conversationally, yet with a precision that left no room for evasion. She outlined the sequence of events, the misdirection, the careful timing, the manipulation of others' perceptions, and the concealed knowledge that had allowed the fatal moment to occur unnoticed. Mrs. Drake, pale and trembling, finally met Miss Marple's calm gaze and, with a faint quiver in her voice, confessed to her role in the Colonel's death, revealing a mixture of fear, resentment, and coercion that had led to the tragic act. The constable took careful notes, yet it was Miss Marple's quiet, unassuming reasoning that had untangled the complex web, revealing the truth hidden behind polite facades and whispered conjectures. Clara and Henry, though relieved that the mystery was resolved, could not hide the residual tension and shock, and the villagers, too, absorbed the revelation with a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and relief. Miss Marple, seated once more near the hearth, reflected on the subtle interplay of human nature that had produced the tragedy, aware that greed, fear, and resentment often operate in quiet, nearly invisible ways until circumstances allow them to manifest. The manor, now subdued, held a fragile calm, the earlier chaos giving way to an uneasy but restored order, as those present contemplated the consequences of their own actions and the lessons in vigilance, perception, and discretion that Miss Marple had quietly imparted. In the stillness that followed, she allowed herself a faint, knowing smile, the satisfaction of justice gently administered through observation, understanding, and patient reasoning, while the manor settled into a quietude that promised neither forgetfulness nor repetition, only the measured acknowledgement of human complexity and the inescapable truth that had finally been revealed.